conspiracy theories are dangerous.
Information is the oxygen of a democracy.
With Republicans, with progressives, with libertarians, because this is not about right and left, this is about right and wrong.
It's so sick we can't talk about it. It actually lifted up, and it could actually turn.
Today we're going to try something completely different. Johnny Harris, who's an amazing journalist who has worked for Vox and many other companies, who now does his own thing with his own media studio on YouTube, just put out a video about the global economy. A really compelling narrative about how the geopolitical situation between the US and China is eroding the connections and the alliances that free trade created around the world. And it's a really compelling video, but there's just one problem. It is completely backwards. He's shilling for big corporations, and I don't think he even realizes it. So without further ado, let's get started.
The US government is quietly reshaping the global economy in ways that will change our world forever. You can see this in just one sentence from Joe Biden's first address to Congress.
Think about it. There is simply no reason why the blades for wind turbines can't be built in Pittsburgh instead of Beijing. No reason. No reason. None.
This seems just like a boring political statement, but I promise this statement is a bigger deal than it seems, because it marks a new era in our global system, a system that all of us participate in, whether we know it or not. Or maybe it's a rerun of an economic system that the globe turned to right before the Second World War.
There's no reason why American workers can't lead the world in the production of electric vehicles and batteries. I mean, there is no reason. You have the capacity.
In this video, I want to peek under the hood of the endlessly complex and fascinating global economy to show you just how deeply connected we've all become and how those connections are being cut and weaponized. All of this thanks to new threats, new risks, new realizations, new values, and above all, a new rivalry between two great powers. This is the world that we are moving into. It's how things will work for decades to come, and it's important that we understand it.
I could not agree more, Johnny. It's important that we understand it. In this video, I'm going to attempt to give a response to Johnny's more mainstream reporting on the global economy and the situation in the world right now from the perspective of deep politics journalism. Journalists like Whitney Webb, journalists like Peter Dale Scott, like Johnny Vedmore, people that are asking who is really calling the shots, who is really holding the power, and who is manipulating the world to their own gains. And it's not that there's some secret cabal ruling the world. It's not that there's like a table with 6 billionaires making all the decisions. But there are people that have outsized amounts of power that have verifiably done terrible things throughout history that have shaped the world that we now live in. And your video makes no mention of any of it. And in omitting that information, you paint a very skewed narrative of how we got to where we are.
Let's dive into this story. It's a big one, it's an important one, and I'm excited to share it with you. The economy that we live in, that we all take for granted, is actually relatively new. The clothes that you're wearing right now, the computer or the phone that you're looking at to watch this video, the materials that your house is made out of, the fibers in the blanket that you use at night, the food you eat, all of it is a product of perhaps one of the most significant achievements of our species, global trade.
Can I suggest that we don't call it global trade, but instead call it globalization? Because it's being done by a group of globalists, by people that are pushing for the interconnectedness of our world because it benefits them, not because it benefits us. And sure, we have all benefited greatly from global trade, from globalization, but that is not why the people doing it are doing it. This process of globalization has been orchestrated and pushed by people like this, Henry Kissinger and Klaus Schwab more recently. It has been financed and built by corporations like this. But it all started with people like this. And if you know who these people are and you know their actual history, you would realize why the system that they started was not off to a great start. And if you knew the history of Kissinger and Klaus as just two examples, you would know why it's not in great hands today. Henry Ford was an overt Nazi, and he spread some of the most deeply anti-Jewish propaganda you could ever imagine leading into World War II. He was given the highest medal of achievement by Hitler himself for his company's contributions to Germany, and more specifically for his contributions to Germany's perspective on Jewish people. But perhaps even more importantly, globalization was orchestrated in a large part by the Central Intelligence Agency and the other intelligence networks in our world that were led by people like Alan Dulles, who was also an overt Nazi sympathizer. As this video goes on, you'll see that people like Dulles, people like Kissinger are American by heritage, but their allegiance was not to America for America's sake. Alan Dulles lied to the president multiple times in no small ways. He concocted deals that favored Nazis over American interests because those Nazis had business ties to him and his businesses and his power base. Even up to modern times, people that seemed infallible, like Obama, who actually ran on a platform supported by the big banks. Although he promised to regulate the banks in the wake of the 2008 collapse, we will examine later briefly how Obama was a stooge for the big banks, and he filled his cabinet with Citibank appointees. So when you say that America has orchestrated this globalization, all throughout your video, Johnny, you claim that America is behind this global network of free trade. Americans do not equate to America. When Obama chose his cabinet full of Citibank appointees, he was not doing so for the betterment of America. He was doing so for the betterment of his own campaign and his donors, the banks, and their interests. And the banks have never been interested in America.
Early on, humans discovered the magic that occurs when a group of people specialize in producing something valuable, like grain. They make more than they need, and then they take that excess and they give it to another group who also made too much of something because they specialize in a specific thing, maybe textiles. And through this exchange, both parties benefit way more than they could on their own. It was this kind of cooperation that leveled our species up beyond any other animal on Earth. So we just kept doing it. In fact, the history of our human civilization is largely the history of people trading on an ever-growing scale. Today, this is normal. We call it the economy.
A lot of people these days think of the economy as like a thing that you go to college to study, that like it's a monolith that exists as it is, and that is not what the economy is. The economy is millions of interactions that arise out of basic human nature of the exchange of value through goods, services, time, interaction, favors, all sorts of things. Excellent job implying the extremely complex nature of the economy as a natural network of human interactions that arises from basic human nature. I'm gonna try not to just shit on your video the whole time because I appreciate you a lot.
By the time the 1900s rolled around, we had a pretty connected world. There was global trade all over the place, but it was still pretty clunky. Everyone had different trade rules, different currencies. Countries were worried that foreign products would threaten their domestic producers, so they put up trade barriers and imposed big tariffs on stuff coming into their country. Then 70 years ago came that war that almost tore this world apart.
Actually, globalization was well underway by the time the Second World War happened. Like, have you ever been to the Wikipedia article about the US involvement in regime change? This is a list of all of the wars, coups that the US has sponsored over time. Each of these headings is a new one. We're all the way back in the 1800s and 1900s here. And this is the US mostly covert involvement in overthrowing democratically elected leaders, installing governments that are favorable to American interests. And by American, I mean businessmen. I mean power people. I don't mean you and me. This list goes on and on and on. And even since World War II and since the founding of the CIA, the US empire's involvement in regime change around the world has only accelerated over time. Just a few examples here. In Bolivia, a military coup putting in a dictator that toppled President Juan Jose Torres, i.e. a democratically elected president. This was not a peaceful or bloodless change of power. In Laos, there was a lot of opium production, a lot of destabilization of China being attempted by the US covert government, the CIA, and we overthrew the leadership in Laos. But then we also assassinated and overthrew the leadership of South Vietnam, our alleged allies against the North, because the South Vietnamese dude was not doing what we wanted in the Vietnam conflict. Or in the Congo, which we will come back to when we talk about child labor, Patrice Lumumba is actually kind of like iconic in the history of the CIA. Like, you're painting a picture as though these poor, silly countries were trying to block off their borders against this great free trade thing, when in fact, these poor countries were trying to defend themselves against our empire's military might coming in and overthrowing their leaders so that we could install the people that we wanted. Or our corporations, like the United Fruit Company, overthrowing leaders in places like Guatemala so that those corporations could conduct business with no oversight however they wanted and use the populace as free or cheap labor however they wanted. Globalization was built on the backs of indentured servitude, basically slave labor, massive civil rights violations against poor people all around the world.
Out of the ashes of that war, the US emerged as the most powerful country ever. It had troops and influence in every corner of the globe. And with that new power, the US and its allies wrote a new playbook for the world economy.
You're right, Johnny, that out of the ashes of World War II, the US emerged as the power force in the world. But it's important to remember that that happened because that war devastated every country in Europe, leaving them extremely vulnerable to financial takeover. And the industry in the US was not aligned to the US. But throughout the war, the banking powers were financing both sides, and the covert intelligence powers were collaborating with those banking powers to keep tabs on both sides. And as soon as the war ended, people like Alan Dulles went behind the president's back to try to save as many Nazis as possible, like this dude, or to try to save as many Nazi bankers as possible. As a country, America was the dominant force in the world at the time. But as a country, America was not for its own people at the time, as it never has been. It was the ruling class of powerful politicians who had been bought and paid for and elected for powerful banks, powerful military contractors, powerful corporations. And they now sat on the top of the pyramid in a world devastated by war, ready to take everything by force. And by force, I mean money.
They would make it so that the US dollar was the top currency. Everything would kind of be pegged to the US dollar. This helped stabilize the whole system. It helped it move more predictably. It helped countries send and receive money across borders.
Johnny, I gotta say, it sounds like you have not read The Creature from Jekyll Island. You know, this book that gives you a very detailed history of the Federal Reserve that is not federal and has no reserves. You see, in America, we have a central bank that is not American. It is a private corporation that prints money and gives it to the government, so the government is indebted to this private corporation. And that private corporation was founded by a cadre of international bankers that were already ruling banking all around the world, primarily in England and Europe. And if you had dug into the history of the Federal Reserve and the American monetary system, the global monetary system we live in today, you would know that it was extremely contentious at the time. And American politicians that were America first vehemently opposed the founding of the Federal Reserve. And many stated that it was going to be the death of this country. All the way back before any of this started, Andrew Jackson, who was extremely opposed to the international bankers taking over America's banking system, said this: "More than 8 million of the stock of this bank are held by foreigners. Is there no danger to our liberty and independence in a bank that in its nature has so little to bind it to our country?" This is in reference to the second bank of the United States that Andrew Jackson opposed with his whole life. These bankers overtly strategized to put pressure on the American economy by making money scarce, by making people suffering, so that the politicians had no choice but to recharter their banking contracts. Mainstream journalist sources love to debunk and fact check this whole Jekyll Island conspiracy, and the Federal Reserve was not even a big deal, and it's totally a good thing, and it wasn't even secretive. That's all made up, except that people that were there directly said, quote, "I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted. If it were to be exposed that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatsoever of passage by Congress." And then they snuck the bill through right when all of the senators had left for the holiday break, and most of them were not there to oppose their bill. And one of the senators that was still there said, quote, "When the president signs this bill, the invisible government by the monetary powers will be legalized. The people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed. The worst legislative crime of the ages is perpetrated by this banking bill, the one that established the Federal Reserve." That was in 1913. They had a full 30 years before World War II started to expand their influence, and we have not had capitalism and have not lived in a free market economy ever since. Because if you do not have real money, you do not have free markets. And you don't have real money when you give control over the printer to a specific group of powerful people that can print money when and how they want. When they print it, they spend it first, and then as it goes out into the economy, it inflates and its value decreases. And so the people with the printer have the most valuable money, and the people farthest away from the printer have the least valuable money. These were a bunch of the guys that were involved in the founding of the Federal Reserve. And can we just take a moment to stop and pause and talk about Mr. Warburg over there? Warburg was instrumental to the founding of the Council on Foreign Relations early in the 1900s, and several other globalist organizations, policy think tanks that have been quietly influencing our government ever since. Groups like the Council on Foreign Relations are instrumental in advising the president and the cabinet and all of our senior military officials on whether to go to war, where to go to war, and how to go to war, including World War II. And it was founded by bankers, and it is still run by bankers today. Another noteworthy globalist organization, a think tank, is the Atlantic Council, which is directed by multiple ex-directors of the CIA and directors of Central Intelligence. Its member groups are people like Pfizer, Raytheon, Blackstone, the World Bank. It is chaired by an executive from Goldman Sachs, obviously to protect democracy. You know, the kind of democracy whose top donor is Goldman Sachs. The Atlantic Council is heavily involved in shaping current foreign policy and war. I mean, the spread of democracy, obviously. And lastly, it's important to note that the end of World War II was the rise of the age of intelligence, because during World War II, covert intelligence networks became extremely important to the war effort. And all of the nations quickly realized that in this modernized day with planes and vehicles, with communication systems like the telegram or the telephone, with the advancement of technology, it became way more apparent that covert operations and covert intelligence and covert control was the future of conflict. It wasn't like the US government and the US worker and the common people in America that were spreading democracy around the world to all these impoverished nations after World War II. It was the bankers that had made a shitload of money off of both sides of World War II, and the international corporations that were now having a heyday with the destroyed economies of all these other countries all around the world, spreading their democracy to all of those other countries.
The US also got countries together with the goal of lowering the taxes imposed on products flowing in and out of their country, tariffs. And through all these efforts, all these new rules, borders opened up. Investors could put their money almost anywhere on Earth to grow new businesses. Corporations could look to faraway lands for cheaper workers to set up their factories. The world became one big market.
No, the world did not become one big market. It became one big sweatshop, ruled and presided over by gigantic mega corporations. But don't worry, you can always find some shill-ass journalist to write an article about how mega corporations are great. Just pay no attention to everywhere else in the world where it's not great.
And it started to benefit hundreds of millions of people. So much so that even anti-capitalist China couldn't stay out of this global economy that was so unrecognizably open, that was so much more open than anything the world had ever seen. There was way too much money to be made. So China jumped in. They said that they would remain communist, but they would open up a few dozen of their coastal cities to be open for business in this new global market. Millions of China's rural poor flocked to the coastal cities, these gateways to the global market. They showed up ready to work, and to work for cheap. A world away over in the United States, corporations looked at all of their factories in places like Detroit and Buffalo and realized that it would make a lot more sense for them to move all of these factories to China, where they could pay workers a fraction of the wage. And spoiler alert, all these coastal cities in China that opened up to the global economy soon looked like this.
Bro, how are you gonna make the export of American labor to third world countries a good thing? Do you realize what you're talking about right now? Like, the export of labor to third world countries is not a win for democracy or for capitalism or for free trade or for anyone. This is what it is. It's sweatshops. When you talk about them sending their labor over to other countries because it was more economically efficient, what you're talking about is child labor, dude. And the American companies that were engaging and still engage in these practices do not give a shit about human rights. That's why they did this. This time of globalization and free trade expanding around the world is a time of child labor in every corner of the globe to fuel corporate profits in American and European businesses. Like, this is what forced labor looked like in the colonial era in countries that were colonized. And this is what your free market capitalism, free trade saving the world looks like today in the Congo, for example. This trend did not lift regular people out of poverty. It enriched wealthy businessmen all around the world and turned the whole rest of the world into sweatshops and favelas and deeply divided wealth disparities. Way more so than we see in America, and it's pretty bad in America already.
Hundreds of millions of people in China lifted out of poverty and thrust into this new middle and upper class, all thanks to the magic of the global economy, based on the rules and policies that the US had set up after World War II.
Man, based more like on the rules and policies that certain men that were in America set up after World War II. The Dulles brothers both played a critical role in Bretton Woods and in those economic policies that laid the groundwork for the globalization of the world, i.e. the corporate global takeover. And big surprise, they were corporate lawyers for the biggest corporate law firm in the world that had represented reprehensible companies like United Fruit that got them to help United Fruit overthrow the democratically elected president of Guatemala so that they could continue to abuse laborers in Guatemala for dirt cheap and a lot of other horrible things. Like, I shit you not, just look it up for yourself. It's not hard to find this research. Like, it's so easy to verify what I'm talking about. These dudes were just two of many extremely corrupt people that were intimately involved in writing these policies that you're referring to right now. And those policies laid the groundwork for what John Perkins talks about in his book, The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. The International Monetary Fund, which is like a global bank that was designed to like help finance the like industrialization of like economies around the world, to really help lift them out of poverty by putting them into massive amounts of debt that they could never repay. So that then once you can't repay the debt, you're beholden to the IMF and their buddies. Do you guys know about international corporate law? Do you know that there's actually like a global legal system that allows corporations to take countries to court and sue them, or worse? These global legal systems were written by corporations and their benefactors in order to benefit corporations so that they could do things like avoid taxes, avoid climate regulations, combat the raising of minimum wages, or quell protests or other activities that might interfere with their profit making. Policies of global corporate welfare, whereby a government like the United States says like, oh, we're going to give international aid to Sudan. But actually what that means is we're going to give a bunch of taxpayer money to giant corporations that are going to go help Sudan build more infrastructure. But that means that the corporations are the ones benefiting. They're the ones making the money by being paid to build the infrastructure in Sudan. And Sudan is just getting more and more indebted to these corporations and the global monetary system. Or special economic zones, whereby corporations literally carve out whole sections of nations that are not their own and then basically declare sovereignty in them, within which they can do whatever they want and are exempted from basic laws that protect human rights, or that force them to pay taxes or contribute to the local economies, or what have you. It also creates a web of secretive jurisdictions where multinational corporations and elites can stash their money so that they can't pay taxes on them and they can't be sued or taken to court. Not to mention private corporate armies, whereby corporations are literally hiring armies to defend their corporate operations, their businesses, don't look too far into that one. Nothing about this was good for regular people. It was not good for the regular people in those countries, and it was only good for the regular people in America until the chickens came home to roost. And we didn't notice it because our lives were great. And so we didn't, at least a lot of the American people didn't think to ask enough questions to stop this. Because we're all riding high on great tales about free trade and about cheap washing machines and about all this great democracy being spread around the world. Narratives matter a lot, and the people in power have known this for a very long time, and they try very hard to control the narrative that the voting public is told. And that is why I'm ripping you so hard right now, Johnny, because you are unwittingly producing a propaganda video for corporate interests right now. No.
It was so good for China and a bunch of other countries, but for the many Americans whose jobs had just been given to someone in like Shanghai, this didn't feel like magic. It felt like betrayal, like a recipe for poverty and ghost towns.
Yeah, in America, it was a recipe for poverty and ghost towns as we shipped American jobs overseas for corporate interests. But for everyone else around the world, it was a recipe for corporate slavery. And it wasn't an accident. It was explicit, complex policy by these corporations and the intelligence agencies and the banks working together to fleece the world for all that they could get.
This China shock was one of the first big tastes of the economic pain that this global economy could inflict on huge numbers of people. But to everyone else, it was totally worth it, because thanks to this system, people were suddenly seeing prices at their stores drop further than seemed possible. Washing machines, shoes, tools, toasters, couches, shirts, socks, toys, mattresses, lawn chairs, anything you can think of is now flowing from Chinese factories and available for dirt cheap at your local Walmart, all while transforming the lives of people in places like Vietnam, India, Chile, and Thailand, who saw huge economic growth during these years.
Oh my God, Johnny, are you really trying to say this right now? Dude, don't do this to us. Are you real? Your narrative right now is advocating for moving American factories over to China so that we can have sweatshops in China because that's good for global free trade? No, this did not lift millions of Chinese people out of poverty. It lifted them out of their farming communities that were impoverished in the countryside and moved them into little tiny boxes in the city so that they could do this for 14 hours a day for very low pay. That's not lifting them out of poverty. Just because China suddenly had tall buildings does not mean that it was good for the average person in China.
So by the 80s, China's fully in the global economy, and it is a gravy train. The US and UK both elect leaders who love this free trade global capitalism.
More trade, not less, is the wave of the future.
The new system was boosted by all of this new technology that was coming out, making it easier to pass information across borders, to move money, to move people, to move goods across the globe.
Yeah, the 80s also made it way easier to commit financial crimes unlike anything before, like the savings and loans crisis, like Drexel Burnham Lambert abusing the junk bond market, like Michael Milken stealing billions and billions of dollars from the global financial system by committing crimes. He is to this day one of the wealthiest people in the world, despite being convicted and fined a whopping $500 million cut of the profits. Like, I'm sure we've all seen the movie about this guy by now.
A globe that used to be vast and daunting and closed, but now just looked like a giant marketplace. All of this transforming in a matter of decades.
You see how the vibe of your video, Johnny, is a little bit off with the context that I'm adding here? And that you're painting it as some like utopic time when free trade and democracy was spreading all around the world, but like you're ignoring the actual nature of what that spread looked like. And it was kind of a dark time. We haven't even talked about how the CIA got caught smuggling drugs and arms to the Iran-Contra conflict, and how the CIA was involved in heroin smuggling all around the globe during the Vietnam War. And all the little proxy wars and secret coups that were being staged all throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s all around the world to make sure that no one took over countries that were going to be not pro-corporations and pro-free markets. Because you know a market is free when you have to kill a guy in order to keep it free because he wanted to do something good for his own people, right?
But I need to call something out that is very important and that is maybe not obvious at this point, which is that The seemingly magical process that made the world economy do this wasn't actually thanks to technology. It was thanks to humans' most amazing invention, most amazing technology, policy.
Whoa. Pump the brakes, bro. Let's go back to this graph real quick and compare it. The global economy wasn't just growing because everyone was so much more productive. Like, that production is also a measurement of money value in the system. And it just so happens that those bankers that were in charge of our global monetary system at the Federal Reserve were printing an insane amount of money all throughout the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. Like, yeah, policy was responsible for the insane growth of the global economy. But that policy is a lot more complicated than just line go up good, because line went down bad. If you're not reading this, this is inflation represented as the declining value of a dollar. Because it turns out that when you let rich people that have tons of assets print the money, more money makes assets more valuable, and it makes money less valuable. And so when regular people like you and me hold on to money, we get poorer and poorer and poorer. And the people holding assets get richer and richer and richer. Not an accident. They know how this works. It is literally their job to know how money works. Despite Jerome Powell's bumbling, I just didn't expect inflation when I printed money. I don't know. If you had asked the average American 10 years ago what they thought of inflation, most of us would not have been very informed and would not have had a strong opinion. But by now, we all know what inflation feels like, and we know why it happens. Certainly, the global economy did grow because of massive increases in productivity, because of policies that interconnected the globe and benefited corporations so that they could produce more. But you are delusional if you think that line go up means good in every circumstance.
Policy. Words on a page that establish rules that countries and people promise to obey. If we all believe and obey these rules, it creates the conditions that made the world into a giant marketplace where a corporation could source whatever they needed to make their product from anywhere in the world, whatever made the most economic sense.
Oh my God, bro, you just said it out loud. You just said it. Wherever makes the most economic sense means wherever you can abuse workers the most thoroughly. This era of corporate expansion was literally the codifying of corporate law around the world at odds with human well-being. It's just that when this system is flowing outwards from a centralized place like the United States, the people in the United States are the last ones to feel the pain, because the pain is first inflicted everywhere else around the world, and the chickens don't come home to roost until the system starts to collapse. And by system, I mean empire. Because what World Wars I and II very clearly indicated to the people of power around the world is that the age of overt empire building through military force is over. That's not what's going on anymore. And they explicitly changed their strategy to building economic empires.
Soon, products as simple as a t-shirt would travel along an unfathomably complex supply chain using material and labor from many countries all around the globe before eventually showing up conveniently just in time at the store. Policy had created mass cooperation between billions of people who don't speak the same language, who don't know each other, but are somehow all getting in on the same market.
That's right, Johnny. We are getting all in on the same market. And maybe it's about time we confronted the realities of what is holding that market up. Like, a lot of the things that Johnny's saying here are true. It's like, yeah, the global economy is complex, and yeah, a lot of incredible things have come out of it. But that's only one side of the coin. And if you only understand one side of the coin, then when you flip it and are told to call heads or tails, you really don't understand what you're being asked to do, right? Like, when you're given two options, and you're told to choose between the two, you'd think you're choosing between two options, right? But I think by now we all realize that actually we pretty much only have one option, and it's to vote for this guy that the banks chose or this guy that the banks chose. And like, I voted for Obama because I was ignorant back then, and I didn't realize that Obama was literally just a vote for Citigroup. 1 month before the presidential election of 2008, Citigroup submitted to the Obama campaign a list of its preferred candidates for the cabinet positions in his administration, and that list corresponds almost exactly to the eventual composition of his cabinet. I highlighted all the names out of all of this if you want to quickly check this out, not the least of which being Timothy Geithner, who was instrumental in both establishing the bubble that popped and screwed everyone over, and then instrumental in formulating the bailouts that went to the big banks with our money. And you wonder why they hate WikiLeaks so much and Julian Assange is so screwed. Let's stay on this just one more second, because leading the search for Obama's new economic team was his close friend and Harvard classmate, Michael Froman, a high-ranking executive at Citigroup. And he was also one of Obama's leading fundraisers and introduced him to a lot of his other leading fundraisers. One of whom being the former co-chairman of Goldman Sachs, who served as Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton. Froman didn't even resign from Citibank while he started working with Obama. He overlapped both jobs while he structured the bailout. And appoint all the people into Obama's cabinet straight out of Citigroup's suggestions. And oh boy, was the other side of that choice not any better. It's almost like the people that control the money had some hand in deciding who made it through the presidential race to the general election so that we only had two choices, both of whom were on their team.
This mental construct of economic policy is what created globalization, the globalization we know today.
And the people that wrote the economic policy that rules the world today were not great people. And I know, Johnny, that you've made a video about Henry. And I know you were a little too, shall we say, nice to him. The people that advise and write the economic policies that have been ruling our world for the last century are people like the Council on Foreign Relations or like the World Economic Forum. These are the members of the Council on Foreign Relations. This is who funds them. So who do you think they're looking out for when they write economic policy? These are the donors to the World Economic Forum. They're not advocating for policy that benefit you and me. BP is not advocating for policy that's going to protect the environment. Amazon is not advocating for policy that is going to protect free markets. They are explicitly anti-free markets. AstraZeneca is not advocating for policies that are good for public health. They're advocating for policies that help them sell more drugs. This is why it's important to talk about the people that write the policy, not just the policy. You need to follow the money. Like, how did you make a video about the current global economy and not once mention the Federal Reserve or any banks? What?
And what's crazy to me is that if you tinker with the policy, if you mess with this, you can reverse a lot of this globalization, which is exactly what's happening right now.
There is simply no reason why the blades for wind turbines can't be built in Pittsburgh instead of Beijing.
Okay, but let's stick to our timeline here. We're kind of in the 90s. And I'll tell you, people in the 90s would have never guessed what direction this story is about to go. The Soviet Union had just fallen. Free trade and global capitalism had unambiguously beat communism, and the magic of the free market was seen as the solution for pretty much everything.
No, by this time, by the 90s, free trade was already just a myth perpetrated by the people that had killed free trade. None of these guys want or support free trade. They want monopolies. This graph shows the rise of lobbying in the United States Congress. Here's another look at the same data separated out by sector. That's taken from this report. And lobbying is the epitome of not free trade. The whole point of lobbying, of corporate lobbying, is to implement governmental policies that will impede free trade so that corporations can have their way with the world. But the art of lobbying is phrasing such policies so that they sound like they promote free trade. But I would encourage you to go and ask anyone who has ever been in a business competing with Amazon how they feel about free trade in America right now.
Free trade had just ended global conflict between these great superpowers, maybe forever. Free trade was eradicating global poverty. Free trade was pushing countries to adopt democracy. And here's Bill Clinton, giddy about how good it's all going.
I'm pretty sure he was giddy about something else, bro.
Predicting that free trade would bring democracy to China.
The more China liberalizes its economy, the more fully it will liberate the potential of its people. Their initiative, their imagination, their remarkable spirit of enterprise. And when individuals have the power not just to dream, but to realize their dreams, they will demand a greater say.
Free trade would prevent our age-old human curse, war.
Do we need to go back through our Wikipedia article about the US involvement in regime change? We never ended war. We just changed the nature of it so that it was small, covert conflicts whereby we replaced rulers and funded coups and funded dictatorships. Like, There has been a lot of war. It's just been a lot more asymmetric and unfair because now it's a massive empire perpetrating it on tiny countries that have no defenses. And we all have been made painfully aware of what that looks like lately. Like, the most basic read of the history of the CIA clearly shows that we've had plenty of war since they were founded after World War II.
By so deeply entangling countries in mutually beneficial deals that it wouldn't make sense to fight. After all, free trade had turned Europe from a continent ravaged by war to this tightly knit group where everyone's holding hands and smiling together.
It wasn't free trade that did that, dude. It was a war that ravaged all of their economies so that a elite class of globalists could come in and save them all with their infusions of money and debt and promises. And you know what happens after that? What you are describing is the spread of a globalist empire through economic means, not free trade. They're all holding hands and smiling together because they all live in the heart of the empire instead of in the production zones of the empire. The people in the production zones of the empire are not holding hands and smiling.
Why wouldn't this naturally just happen to the whole globe? China continued to make stuff and send it to the United States. Our dependency on them and them on us continued to grow, and that would surely prevent any conflict, right? No. It's looking like that's not how it's going to turn out. In fact, it's kind of the opposite.
The new tariffs from both sides went into effect earlier this morning. The US has imposed 10% tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports.
China is our military's most consequential strategic competitor and pacing challenge.
I hope that from the evidence that I've shared so far, it's becoming pretty apparent to you that we're not looking at a war between the US and China. We're looking at a fundamentally more complex conflict of a global empire built by Western-based corporations that are not aligned to any one nation.
In a relatively sudden shift, governments around the world are undoing a lot of this globalization, this solution to all of our problems. They're rejecting it.
Do you see how dangerous journalism can be when applied without finesse? The solution, it's just presented as a foregone conclusion by Johnny that it's the solution to all of our problems? Exactly whose problems is this type of cobalt mining a solution to? Is this the solution to all of our green energy problems? Doing this to people for our benefit? Is child labor in sweatshops all around the world the solution to my problem of wanting a t-shirt for cheaper? Is letting the Atlantic Council's and Goldman Sachs's policies that they're writing for the American government the solution to everyone's problems all around the world? What are you saying, Johnny? And why are you saying it? Because when I look at this list of corporations that are funding groups like the World Economic Forum, I see people that have created a lot more problems than they've solved. Is it the solution to the fact that none of us will ever be able to afford a home again? Is it the solution to the fact that parents in one of the wealthiest countries in the world can't afford food for their kids? Is it the solution to the fact that we have more debt now than ever before and we can't afford to go to college if we even wanted to? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the people that are behind this globalist empire have been in charge all along while these problems have been getting worse and worse and worse.
India is paying companies to keep their production within their own borders, especially for important industries like pharmaceuticals and electronics. South Korea is giving taxpayer money to companies to produce green energy infrastructure instead of waiting for the free market to come build it. Japan is paying companies to move production back to Japan and to move their supply chains away from China. Australia is using taxpayer money to encourage mining companies to establish the processing of rare earth mineral facilities within their borders instead of abroad. Nigeria is imposing restrictions on foreign goods that they want to see produced domestically, like rice and cement. They don't want to be reliant on other countries. And then you've got Europe, where tons of countries are investing government money and protecting homegrown industries that have always been directed by the global economy, like energy, agriculture, and cars. The government getting involved in these markets incentivizes companies and consumers to make and sell these products in country, as opposed to looking abroad at the global market.
Good. Reject some of this free trade. Make more things in your own countries. Johnny, you are concerned with global CO2 emissions, which is a whole other debate that we don't have time for right now. Why are you suddenly arguing that shipping the ingredients for a tofu burger 10 places around the world before it comes to America is a good thing. That's like the heart of greenhouse gas emissions, bro. Like, what? Like, yeah, an interconnected world is a great thing, but like, we don't need to interconnect literally everything about the world. Like, you can grow a garden. That's good for you. We don't need our cotton to be flying halfway across the world to then get turned into t-shirts, to then fly halfway across the world, to then get branded, to then fly halfway across the world, to then get bought. That's not necessary. Not to mention how much better off all the other countries around the world would be if the money that their people were spending were going into corporations and companies based in those countries, so that that money would circulate within their countries instead of going into the coffers of giant mega corporations that just hide all their money in tax havens and give multi-million bonuses to their CEOs. Like, what are we advocating, dude?
And of course, leading out on all of this is the OG of the modern free market global economy, the United States, who is suddenly changing course from how they've been operating all the way up until like Obama. Like, Obama spent a great deal of his time trying to increase free trade, especially with Asia.
Obama was doing a lot more than just that during his time. He was also busy drone striking the absolute living daylights out of Afghanistan. But don't worry, I'm sure their intel on who were foreign combatants versus who were civilians was totally square. And there was never any mistakes in this reporting of who was and was not a legitimate military target.
First under Trump and now under Biden, the US is overhauling its economic policy to turn back some of this free trade. And what's crazy is that both Republicans and Democrats seem to agree that we should do this, and fast.
There is no reason. We have the capacity.
Some of these policies include huge government spending bills like the CHIPS Act, which would allocate over $50 billion government dollars to companies that produce microchips here in the United States, instead of in Asia, where the free market had pulled them to set up. This is also happening in other industries that the government has deemed vital, like critical minerals, cars, and clean energy.
So based on the read of history that I'm proposing, actually, it does beg the question, why is all of this constriction and reduction of global trade happening right now? And I would argue that it's because we're preparing for a global conflict, because the empire is being challenged or is falling apart, whichever way you see it. And World War III is going to look significantly different than World War II. It's hard to even say if there will be boots on the ground, because you don't need boots on the ground to take down a country anymore. We'll make other videos about what World War III might or may not look like.
But they're not just giving subsidies, like it's not just government money washing down on all these industries. It's also barriers. Biden is imposing tariffs on imports, which protects domestic producers of certain industries because they no longer have to compete with the global market.
Yes, Johnny, it protects American workers. That is not a bad thing. Bro, oh my God. What are you doing in this video? You're a cool guy. You advocate good things. You have great videos. What the f is this video, man? Does someone have a video of you with kids or something? Like, what's going on, dude?
They're also banning American companies from selling certain products to China. They're increasing scrutiny on any investment that comes in from places like China. Like, this is a big shift. And the question is, what happened?
What happened? Well, I think if you just dig a little deeper into like how money works and how power works and who has it all, it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly what happened and what is happening. And I would invite you to do that dig. Please, you have 4 million followers, do that dig. I could genuinely care less who does the dig as long as we start talking about it.
How did we get from this free trade heyday that was supposed to usher in world peace to this?
Markets have been whipsawed all morning and now afternoon by this ongoing trade war with China.
The short answer is one word. The answer to all of this: protection. Here's my list of 4 protections that best explain this big shift in economic policy.
All right, we're gonna have a lot to say about this list. I'm gonna try to not get carried away here.
First, workers, which we already kind of talked about briefly with the China shock. For all the winners of the global economy, there were lots of losers, and a lot of them were communities who found themselves out of work as their jobs went to cheaper overseas locations. Now listen, economists argue as to how big of a problem this actually was, and you can read all about it in my sources. But the point is that closed factories and unemployed communities in the Rust Belt have a major psychological effect on people who fear that their jobs might just disappear, either abroad or be taken over by AI. So the government is trying to calm people down by pumping money into certain sectors to keep jobs in America.
Bro, are you really claiming that the government has ever tried to protect workers? Please read A People's History of the United States, where Howard Zinn lays out in explicit detail how corporations and government have literally gone to war against workers since the founding of this country. No one is trying to protect workers. They're trying to protect their money, their voter base, their power, their shit. They're happy to exploit workers wherever they're allowed to exploit workers. We just have guns and rights in America. And I guess we have votes for whatever that's worth in 2023. But please, ask an average American blue-collar worker if they feel like Joe Biden has protected them in any way since he was elected.
The next big realization about the global economy, it doesn't really care much about how much carbon it pumps into our atmosphere. Our world is barreling towards a very real climate crisis, and governments realize they're gonna have to force the market to get serious about things like electric cars, solar panels, and other green infrastructure. The free market is not going to incentivize this, and if it doesn't happen, we're gonna have a much bigger problem on our hands.
Johnny, we don't really have time to go into this right now, but the system that you are advocating is the primary producer of greenhouse gases, and the corporations that you are shilling for right now are the main culprits. And a world where it takes 5 different boats of this size to make a hamburger at my local McDonald's is not a world that is promoting less greenhouse gas emissions, which is not even the most important part of climate change. Soil, regenerative agriculture, way better rabbit hole to go down, but that's for another time. And don't even get me started on how these mega corporations pollute with oil spills and such without giving a shit.
One of the best parts of the global economy is that our products get made by materials that are being tossed around the globe at the perfect time, at the perfect place, to all come together to be made into a final product, all to arrive at a shelf at some store so that we can purchase it.
Bro, how are you literally gonna advocate for things getting shipped all around the world for no reason immediately after saying we need to be taking climate change more seriously? What are you saying, Johnny? Oh, dude. That is so backwards. Just think local, act local, buy local, support small businesses, please.
These supply chains are insane, and they cross the entire planet. And it works great until the world shut down in a global pandemic, leaving people around the world without the products that they either needed or just kind of got used to having. Again, economists argue about how big of a deal this was. A lot of them are like, no, the supply chains held up really well during COVID. But regardless of what some academic economist is saying at MIT, all of us are left with a pretty bad taste in our mouth about supply chains after COVID. The system feels too fragile. A lot of us feel too reliant on a fragile system of faraway global connections that could be rocked at any moment, which has led to these protectionist policies that these governments hope will bring supply chains back inside of their borders. Okay, finally, and perhaps the most important explanation in all of this, is that Bill Clinton was totally wrong. Free trade didn't incentivize China into a democratic revolution. The world did not join together in one big free trade market, too entangled to fight with each other. In fact, quite the opposite has happened.
Yes, completely correct. I agree. A giant global empire formed and tried to take over everything through economic and monetary policies, and that pissed a lot of people off, and now we have some enemies. And China would not necessarily be a good person to rule the world either. We don't really like them. They're not great either. I don't want a social credit score. I don't want you scanning my face to tell me if I can or cannot get on a train. Thank you very much. The empire is threatened. It's as simple as that.
Relations between the world's 2 largest economies are at their most tense in years.
After joining the global economy, China got really rich really fast. They've kind of started to challenge the US at its own game. And now they have one of the biggest militaries on the planet. And they use that military to assert their influence around their region. They use their newfound wealth to project influence around the world by building stuff or giving loans to people. And they're kind of trying to dethrone the United States as the one who's calling the shots on the global economic order. I made a whole video about this that you can go watch if you want, but the big point here is that the US is worried about the rapid rise of their rival across the ocean. especially when the rise of that rival is in part fueled by American technology. Specifically, these little silicon chips, microchips, that make weapons smart, and that will be the brains that power the AI revolution.
So, side note, OpenAI just got taken over by big money, and their board of directors now has Larry Summers on it, who was integral to creating the 2008 financial crisis, and then integral to bailing out the big banks with taxpayer money. And he has been a stooge for the big banks his entire life. And he is now on the board of OpenAI for Lord knows what reason. It's super sketchy. And for some reason, everyone's like, oh, Sam Altman's back. We love him. Yay, OpenAI. No. Whatever's happening at OpenAI is a whole other video. I have been spamming all of their Twitter accounts, asking them to tell me what the fuck Larry Summers is doing on the board of OpenAI. And obviously it's radio silence because they don't want to talk about that. But that's totally off topic. I'm getting distracted.
A lot of Joe Biden's protectionist policies are actually just aimed right at China, trying to stop them from using our own tech to get ahead of us. Again, I made an entire video about microchips. You can go into that. I've kind of made a video about a lot of these things.
You have made a video about a lot of these things, Johnny. I just wish you would make a video about the CIA and a video about how money works and start actually looking at how power and money works, because this whole video is like a giant shill for corporations, and it's not cool. Maybe read One Nation Under Blackmail by Whitney Webb to get a little context on what's going on out here. I'm just a little mind blown that this is your take after all of the amazing journalism that you've done, bro. Come on, man. You're on the team.
Yeah, Joe Biden is also trying to get the supply chains for these microchips out of China's neighborhood, meaning out of Taiwan, bringing them back inside our borders to places like New Albany, Ohio, nice and safe in the middle of our continent. So you're gonna see a lot more moments like this, with American presidents or politicians with hard hats on speaking at construction sites.
Folks, we need to make these chips right here in America to bring down everyday cost and create good jobs. America's back and America's leading the way.
Holy shit, he said multiple sentences in a row without fucking up. That's crazy. So presidential of him. Gosh, I'm so proud.
This last point is kind of a brutal recognition for a lot of people, including me, to be honest, that our theory that we would all be more peaceful if we were more economically entangled is kind of wrong, at least for now.
Of course it's wrong, because you have completely misunderstood history and misunderstood how power and money works. Read Whitney Webb, or read journalists that contribute to her website, Unlimited Hangout, like Johnny Vedmore, who's awesome. Johnny's a real deal journalist at newspace.com that actually digs into what is really going on here. Or check out Richard Grove of the Grand Theft World podcast. This dude knows what's going on here. Question everything. And these guys I'm telling you to read are not conspiracy theorists. They are hardcore, super good journalists that cite their sources like mofos. The truth is out there. Just for some reason it doesn't get pushed out to 4 million followers because who knows how these algorithms work. All I know is that if you want to know what my most important videos are that I've ever made, just go to my TikTok channel and watch the ones with the least views, because those are the ones that are the most important. They all have to do with the CIA.
In fact, these economic entanglements are looking like they might turn into tools of conflict as opposed to preventers of conflict. China has a near monopoly on a lot of the rare earth elements that we need to make a ton of very important products, including military weapons. And if push comes to shove, they could very realistically use this as leverage and cut us off in the exact same way that we cut them off microchips. I mean, this just happened. Vladimir Putin turned off the pipelines that pumped natural gas into Europe, the gas that is needed to heat the homes and run the factories.
Yeah, don't look too deep into what happened to the Nord Stream. We're not allowed to talk about that one.
Showing us that economic entanglements can actually be a weapon, and flipping this whole theory on its head. But yeah, Joe Biden is pouring money into bringing production home, and he has a lot of support from all sides of the aisle. This is like economic nationalism. The government is getting involved to undo some of what the free market did in its heyday, which was to distribute production of stuff where it made the most economic sense, not where it protected people.
Why are you tripling down on telling us that sweatshops are good and that shipping jobs overseas is good, Johnny? That is not a good look, man.
That means we will invent it in America and make it in America. And we're going to make sure we include all of America.
So that's where we're at. The world is reacting to some weaknesses that they see in the global free trade system. They're putting up barriers in the name of protection. And no one's really sure what that means. Like, it's kind of hard to not look at this and draw some parallels with the 1930s, when a series of economic crises led countries to put up trade barriers in the name of protection, which then led to ever greater economic strife, leading to unrest and eventually culminating in the Second World War.
Don't even begin to equate people that are opposing the current globalist situation with Nazis. That is so, don't even, like.
But don't read too far into that. I'm not trying to do one of those things where I'm like, every 100 years, history repeats itself. That's not what I think is happening here. But there's some similarities that we should probably just keep an eye on. A suite of crises that make us turn inward, that surge populism and economic nationalism, and the rise of tensions between great powers.
I do not want a digital ID. I don't want to eat bugs. I don't want to live in a 15-minute city. I don't want AI to decide our elections for us without us voting. And yes, despite what all the mainstream fact checkers would tell you when you search for that video clip, Klaus Schwab actually said that. He said that AI is so good now that we don't even need to have elections because AI can just predict who would win for us and just elect them.
Digital technologies mainly have an analytical power. Now we go into a predictive power, and we have seen the first examples, and your company very much involved into it. But then the next step could be to go into a prescriptive mode, which means you do not even have to have elections anymore, because you can already predict, and afterwards you can say, why do we need elections? Because we know what the result will be.
These are the globalists that you are advocating for, Johnny, and it's not good. They are excessively good at phrasing their policies as though they're for the good of humankind, the greater good. And they're not. They are and have always been for the good of their donors and corporate members. Globalism was created by big money to look out for the interests of big money. And it never gave two shits about what that did to average people.
American conspiracy theories are dangerous.
Information is the oxygen of a democracy.
With Republicans, with progressives, with libertarians, because this is not about right and left, this is about right and wrong.
It's so sick that we can't talk about it. It actually lifted up, and it could actually turn.
I'm gonna ask you to look away.
Legend has it that Christian Rosenkreuz drew his secret knowledge from the wisdom of the ancient Egyptians.
They estimated 100 yards from the left wing was this 100-foot disc.
You begin to get into this very scary scenario that has to do with the human condition, of the proclivity to accumulate vast amounts of power around a handful of people. And right now, these misanthropic sociopaths are running the planet into the ground.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
There's so much evidence out there that even if less than 1% is true, that would be enough to collapse the current paradigm and change the whole planet. Our security is at stake.